Welcome to Detoxicity, a podcast that aims to reframe the narrative around masculinity by way of sharing experiences and stories. If you're looking for one of those alpha male podcasts that isn't centered around things like inclusivity and vulnerability, you are in the wrong place. Or maybe you're in the right place if you recognize that the Joe Rogans and the Red Pills of the world shouldn't be the norm. Anyway, I'm Mike Joseph, I host and produce this show, and I'm happy you're here. We are closing in on 5 years of this podcast, and I appreciate all the support I've received and would love to thank everyone who's been a guest now and in the future for allowing yourselves this space to share your story. If you'd like to know more about the guests, I suggest following them on social media. I usually mention where you can find them at the end of each episode. You can follow me on Instagram at DetoxPodGuy. You can request a free coaching consultation from me at mike-joseph.com. And you can support Detoxicity by spreading the word to friends, by liking and commenting on whatever platform you're using to listen, or by becoming a patron. Go to patreon.com/detoxicitypod and subscribe for as little as $3 a month, and you will get early access to episodes. I'll even send you a cool DetoxPod fridge magnet. Thank you for listening, and enjoy this latest episode. So let's start this episode with a story. If you are a regular listener of this podcast, you will know that quite a few of the guests that I've had on the show practice polyamory or ethical non-monogamy in one way, shape, or form. While I feel like I have always been predisposed to non-monogamy, I didn't really know that there was a name for it or a community associated with it until I'd say about 11 or 12 years ago. Through therapy and reading, I discovered this other world that I was not previously aware of. I was living in Massachusetts at the time, and when I came back to New York, I was like, I'm going to fully step into this world and make friends and foster community. And there have been mixed results over the years, but someone who has been very, very successful at fostering community and who has introduced me to quite a few people is my guest for today's show, Marco. And Marco shuns the term leader. He is certainly a community front person for polyamorous and ethical non-monogamous people here in Brooklyn. He runs a picnic. Or co-runs a picnic, which happens once a month through the spring and summer, and also co-runs a Discord group where a lot of people who are in this lifestyle in Brooklyn kind of hang out and get to know one another. Anyway, part of my conversation with Marco focuses on community building and what that looks like and how that works in New York as compared to other places, but another part of our conversation focuses on something that I was really not familiar with before conceptually, which is basically a relationship surrogate. You'll find out what that means over the course of our conversation. I was pretty blind to it as well, so I get schooled here, and I hope you get a little bit more information about what that's about and whether that might be something that works for you. Marco is very vulnerable during this conversation, and I gotta also point out the fact that he is, in my 50 or so years, the very first person I think I have ever met that hails from North Dakota. So all of that and more in this episode with Marco. Check it out.
So I am Marco. I'm now entering into a career as a surrogate partner. My business is called Anteros Consulting, and I come from a background of being first a lawyer and a advocate in the polyamory community. I live in Brooklyn, New York, and I have a sort of long and convoluted history of how I got here. But which, in case you hadn't noticed from the career changes, there's some of that.
Yes.
That's where I am right now.
So many questions I want to ask if I didn't already know your story just based on that little elevator pitch thingy. But I guess we'll start with, are you from New York, or what brought you to New York?
No, I am, of all places, I'm from Fargo, North Dakota.
What?
Yes, Midwest boy. So I was born and raised there to the children of immigrants. So both my parents come from Europe. My father's Italian and my mother's Czech. So I grew up actually not speaking English for the first few years. I spoke Czech, which I've mostly forgotten. And since then, I've actually been working a fair bit in Italy. So I'm trying to learn Italian and get more in touch with that side of my family. But no, so Midwest upbringing, then central Pennsylvania. Also not really a place that sort of European kid fits into well. I had a good time there. And then after that, I moved around a lot on my own. So New York, lived a little bit in Los Angeles, lived in Australia for a few years, lived in Europe for, I don't know, a few months at a time here and there. And then eventually returned to New York for the last 7 years.
I gotta ask you. So I've spoken to tons of people for this podcast. I've spoken to tons of people in a general sense, and I've been alive for a few decades. You might be the first person I've ever met from North Dakota.
Yeah, they don't leave too often, or I don't know. It's a nice place. It's very peaceful. I think I left at the right time, just by happenstance. I was just becoming a teenager, at which point my understanding is that that's when everybody starts to get into trouble because there's not that much else to do. And I'm sure that would have been me. So the change was probably good. Ending up in a college town in Pennsylvania, there's a bit more to do. So yeah, I think it was a good switch. I actually haven't been back, which is kind of odd. I should check it out at some point.
Do you still have friends or family there?
In Fargo?
Yeah.
No, not really.
Okay. So you would just kind of go back as an observer or as
I'm just curious.
visitor.
I mean, I haven't been back in 30 plus years.
Wow. So was there a specific incident that brought you to New York? Or were you just like, I want to cross something off my list?
No, I moved here to go to law school.
Okay.
That was step one. Then I was working here for a few years, was looking at a change in my career, but stayed in the law firm and just transferred to our Los Angeles office. At the time, I was married, which is a whole other story of motivation and reasoning. Moved to LA for a change of pace with my now ex, my wife, to see if the change in location would be beneficial for our marriage, which was on the ropes at that point. We stuck it out for a few more years in Los Angeles, trying to see if the change of scenery would make a difference, and it ended up not. So when that ended, I packed up and decided to come back to New York, where I felt most comfortable. So I've been here ever since.
And do you feel like, is New York your forever home?
Yes, short answer.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm a very mobile human.
Sure.
I travel a lot, and I like having other places to, like other sort of bases. But I would consider New York my base camp.
Okay.
Home base.
All right. Now, I know you from being. How does it feel to you to be called sort of like a leader in the community?
I avoid that term at all costs. I am an organizer, maybe a facilitator. I love creating spaces for other people to come into and understand what the space is about and set up some guardrails for what the space protects. But I don't generally want to put myself out there as a leader in any sense of an authority, or it's not something I'm particularly comfortable with, because I think people should make their own choices and find their own path. And if I can smooth that path for them, great. But I'm just here to show people things that they might want to see or might want to explore, not to tell them what they should be doing.
Right. So you probably don't remember this. The first time I met you was at a roundtable, which was pre-pandemic. So I want to say it was maybe 2018. And again, I realize you don't like the word leader, but there was certainly the sense that you were one of the humans in charge, I guess.
I organized the roundtable.
Right.
And at that time was probably picking the topics. So sure. Yes.
One thing, because while you and I have crossed paths a number of times, we've never really had a one-on-one lengthier conversation without there being other people around.
That's fair.
So I'm going to ask the very basic poly question, which is, what is your poly origin story?
Yeah, that's a standard question. Yeah, so I would say now, looking back, feel like I was inherently non-monogamous, if not polyamorous, from teenage years, when I started realizing what relationships and sexual desire and all that stuff felt like. I thought initially that it was more just being commitment phobic, but not understanding exactly why. I mean, at the time, I thought I was a clever little teenager and thinking that it just doesn't make sense to settle down too early, keep your options open. And if I'm doing that, then why are we pretending as if every relationship should be an escalator towards marriage, which is what I saw in a lot of the other kids my age, that they would get into relationships and then they would do these sort of patterns that looked as if they were exploring with the other person to see if they were marriage eligible. And I didn't understand why we as essentially kids were doing this, and 16, 17, whatever. And I just thought, I have zero interest in getting married anytime soon, so why am I interviewing people for that role? And I just thought, well, if the point of what I'm doing is just to date someone and experience love or sex or whatever other fun things we wanted to do together, why are we not being explicit about that? And so,
Oh,
as a teenager, I just thought, why not just stay mostly single and tell the people that I was dating that that's what I wanted to do? And I didn't know that there was a term called non monogamy, and definitely hadn't heard of polyamory, which may not have been a very popular term back then. But I used the phrase, like, I want to be non exclusive.
mhm.
So, non exclusive dating was what I was trying to do. And
How'd that go over?
yeah, that's a challenge. When you are a teenager in central Pennsylvania trying to tell people, like, oh, I'd love to date you, but also other people, very few takers. And the few that would be open to it would sort of say, oh, we can try that. And so inevitably what would happen is that you date for approximately 3 months or so, would be this magic number, at which point feelings would develop on probably on both sides, and the non-exclusivity would be a real problem because jealousy would arise, and there just wasn't the language to deal with it. And so most of the time those relationships stopped, and it was a bit heartbreaking actually for me, and because it was a pattern of having these sort of shorter relationships. And yeah, it was a challenge, and I didn't really stop doing that until, I mean, I kept doing my best with my version of non-monogamy until around law school, I think, when I met someone who sounded like they were open to non-monogamy, and then that's how we started the relationship, ended up getting married, and it kind of shifted towards monogamy in a way that I wasn't super excited about. And then for actually other reasons, not that particular reason, the marriage didn't work out. And at the end of that, I returned to my original roots of non-monogamous thinking, at which point I was in New York and found that there are, in fact, support groups, books now that had come out. I mean, the gap in time was really well timed, that when I was a teenager, there were very few resources. The Ethical Slut might have been already out, but just barely, and no other books that I know of. After The Ethical Slut was published, there became tons more books, and now there's just a lovely library of resources and support groups and online resources that everyone can access, and it's just a completely different world. So, and I'm hopefully helping people do the finding places to land with Brooklyn polyamory, and which was a huge resource for me when I first came back into the non-monogamy world.
I think that's awesome. I mean, there are a couple of things at play here. One is the ease in which people online can now find, for lack of a better term, community groups or affinity groups or whatever it is that will sort of justify the feelings that they have internally.
Mm-hmm.
Thinking about my own journey, and 100% there not being resources or even language, I think, to talk about this stuff when I was a teenager through my 20s. It just kind of didn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
And this is all pre-social media, that kind of stuff. And now there are articles, there are books, there's podcasts, there's a million and one other things. And feeling like you and I grew up in different environments, different ways. And even I, for a long time, was just like, I want to be able to explore multiple relationships. But this socialized thing, this thing that we're taught, is that there's something inherently bad, or you should get your fulfillment out of one relationship. And just from a logical standpoint, now I'm just kind of like proselytizing. Just from a logical standpoint, the idea that when you're 17, 18, 16, 19 years old, you are going to meet a person and you and that person are going to spend the rest of your lives together. Great when it happens. And I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but just in terms of knowing how life works feels really illogical.
Right. To me, it was the idea that you're supposed to judge whether or not another person is a good match for you. And what I never understood was on what basis? I have no experience. I have no one to compare this to. In my first, second, or even third relationship, how am I supposed to know whether this is healthy? Whether this is actually making me a better person? Is it rewarding? Is it fulfilling needs that I may not even recognize that I have yet? So even then, and I'm sort of weirdly proud of this, as a kid, I was like, I don't understand how this system is supposed to work. It doesn't seem to make any sense. And I was very confused by the fact that everyone else seems to just go along with it and think, no, no, this is the way it works. It'll be fine. It doesn't seem like it would be.
I mean, statistics bear out that it isn't.
Right. And, even as a teenager, I saw that. I saw lots of divorce. I mean,
You were ahead of your time.
My parents had some struggles in their marriage, and I just thought, well, yeah, maybe they shouldn't have gotten married so young. And maybe if they had thought a little bit more about what's out there and what their options are and had a little more life experience, they could have made better decisions. Yeah, hindsight's 2020, of course, and yeah, I don't want to judge all their decisions, but as a teenager, I was very happy to. So, yeah, I still think it's a strange system, and personally, I still don't fully understand how monogamy in America, anyway, in our culture, is supposed to work. I think that there are versions of it that are very healthy. I think that the mainstream norms around dating and maybe not hardcore purity culture, but just generally in America, the sort of shame around certain aspects of sex and dating a lot, all of that is, to me, very unhealthy and still doesn't make any sense. And I've found a lot of peace in terms of how I approach relationships through polyamory. And it's really been quite impactful in a lot of other ways, because a lot of the things that I had closed off in myself emotionally and like held back a lot of vulnerability and emotions, it was because of a fear of uh, putting all my eggs in one basket, or relying too much on one person to hold something that I find very vulnerable. And amazingly, since I've been much more openly polyamorous and in multiple relationships, I've felt an immense amount of growth in terms of my emotional availability, my empathy, my ability to connect with others and be vulnerable and just sort of share in ways that I wasn't able to do before, which is pretty great.
I feel like when done correctly, non-monogamy and polyamory, which are two different things, force you to work on those different buttons, the empathy, the vulnerability, those things that within the framework of a presumably monogamous lifelong relationship, you should work those buttons regardless, but you don't necessarily have the impetus to do so if you are presumably in a relationship with one person that's never going to leave for the rest of your life.
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. I think that you're right that, well, on the one hand, being non-monogamous and particularly being polyamorous, where there's a lot of emotions involved and it can be fairly complex with multiple people involved who have different viewpoints, and each person has their own particular approach to things. You kind of need to have a lot of empathy or you will probably fail at doing this. So on that front, I completely agree that there's almost a requirement that you need to learn these skills or it's going to be very challenging. The other interesting aspect for me, anyway, that I was pointing to was that I was restricted in monogamy from feeling things or showing that I felt things. Like when I fell in love with someone, I would hold that back because it fell into a sort of a trope of, oh, if you love someone, then they're your one and only, your true love. And there's this, exactly, rom-coms. It's this rom-com trope that once you fall in love with somebody, they fall in love or they're in love with you, everything works out fine, which is obviously not true. But worse than that, it's not true that it's always an exclusive thing. So I know that I have felt love for people that I was dating. I've been in love with people, but did not want to marry them. You know, when I was younger, I was like, oh, this person is not a perfect match for me. Like we're not completely compatible, but but compatibility, like 100% compatibility, the ability to live with someone or want to co-parent with someone or do any of the other things that married people often do, that's not necessary to love somebody. And ever since I had that realization while I was exploring the early stages of polyamory, it was just a complete eye-opening experience that I could now be more comfortable telling someone, hey, I love you. And that is a separate conversation from what I want our life to look like together. It does not mean the picket fence. It does not mean the 2.5 kids. It does not mean we are moving in together and spending all our time together.
Sure.
It's not always about merging. Just because you love someone or are in love with someone, it doesn't have to mean that your relationship is going to take a particular form. And that was an incredibly freeing experience and awareness that, yeah, still to this day makes me much more open to my feelings and to sharing them with people, because what I feel is different than the actions that I expect them to take or that I expect, I should be taking based on those feelings.
Right on. You're preaching to the choir in this particular case, but I think a lot of people listening who don't have a concept of polyamory or have a different concept can get a lot from what you just said. How comfortable are you talking about queerness in regards to your journey?
Perfectly comfortable talking about it, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
How much did that play into polyamory for you, or were they sort of separate discovery tracks?
For me, they were separate, and I'm a little almost shy to express that for me, polyamory has been and non-monogamy have been more important in my life because they've been more central as an issue for me since I was a teenager. I am queer and I enjoy expressing myself sexually with all genders, and but again, a little bit shy about saying it's not as central a part of my identity.
Okay.
To me, the non-monogamy component of my life has been more of an issue. For me, just being with people of any gender is just now seems sort of natural and not a big issue. I think I'm very lucky that I live in New York, and I think the society is further along in terms of the acceptance of,
Doesn't fly the same in North Dakota.
No.
Or central Pennsylvania.
I am still unpacking a lot of the toxicity that I was raised with.
Sure.
There are so many norms and just, I guess, visual cues that cause me to have an initial reaction. For example, very flamboyant outward displays of homosexuality where I'm like, oh wow, that's an outfit I would never wear. That kind of thing. And I do still feel a little strange dressing in a very flamboyant way because of, as being a kid, people would say, oh, you don't want to look like whatever,
Sure.
some slur. And I mean, that was just ever present. And even then I was like, well, why wouldn't I want to look that wrong? Like, why is that wrong? I was fairly open-minded about it, but the sort of shaming of appearance or how you look in public or not being manly or those things did a little bit get internalized, and it's not that easy to unpack that and let that go.
You bring up a really interesting point with that, something that I struggle with very often myself, which is, I am not a particularly flamboyant person. I think particularly in terms of dress and stuff like that. Like I'm a fairly conservative. And what I think I'm trying to unpack is this just because it's where my comfort level is, or is there something internalized that is preventing me from accepting this level of, and it's not accepting because I'm a very come as you are type person, but I look at some of the more flamboyant elements of queer culture and I'm like, I'm not that.
Right.
And it's like, am I not that because I'm not that, or am I not that because I don't want to be that?
Yeah, and why? If
Right.
if that question matters, I asked the same thing where, I go out to Fire Island with friends every now and again, and I was there this summer, and going out to dance is a thing that I find personally uncomfortable because I
Do you
feel,
not like dancing?
well, I do not like dancing.
I mean, that explains it.
That's one that, but even dressing to go out to dance, because I'm happy to fake it and just like have a drink and sit by the wall and watch people dance, but it's almost like I feel like I don't belong, mostly because I'm not gay. I'm pansexual, so there's a little bit of that, in terms of bi erasure or whatever.
Right.
Where do I fit in exactly? But yeah, but it's also the clothing choice. I am a boring dresser, and I'm okay with that. It's not a thing that matters much to me in life. And then there's the identity questions like, oh, should I be dressing a particular way to fit into the group that I self identify as being a part of? And it's all these elements of like, oh no, I don't have to look a particular way, but still feel strange sometimes.
I did. We're very much on the same page there. And I don't know that I've had this particular discussion with another person before,
Huh.
face to face. So this is actually a very good thing because, and I identify as mostly gay.
Mhm.
And as I was going through the coming out process, definitely put myself in elements of gay culture where I did not feel particularly comfortable and felt like I was almost, oh, what's the word? Assimilating almost, right?
Mm,
Like it's weird because I think in queer culture, there's a lot of discussion about assimilating into straight culture.
right.
But what if, yeah, you feel like you're assimilating into queer culture just to sort of be seen as quote unquote legitimately queer?
Exactly.
Right.
That I think is a fascinating question to which I definitely don't have an answer.
Right. I mean, it's the mental calculus
Yeah.
that you're constantly doing in your
Yeah.
head is it can be deafening sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's so much self-doubt and sort of self-judgment about it. Like, just even when we're talking about this, I'm thinking of examples like, when I was raised in Fargo, North Dakota, the idea of, oh, it's a gay man and he's wearing a feather boa and it's pink and something like that. And then realizing as I get older that I'm like, I have zero issues with homosexuality and I'm exploring it, and it's
Right.
part of my life as well.
Right.
And but there's a feeling that like a feather boa is not for me. But then I think, is the feather boa even a thing for, like, why is that the thing that I'm fixating on? Or it's just all these layers of unpacking, like, oh, is that some internalized homophobia?
Right.
And should I like that? Are feather boas nice? Do they feel good to wear? Do they like, and at a certain point I just try to relax about all of it and say, regardless of the reasons or the origin of why I enjoy wearing black and gray most of the time, I'm okay with it at this point. I think I'm just going to wear black and gray most of the time.
I mean, there is like a Marco uniform.
It's honestly, this is one of those things where I'm just lazy, and I've kind of adopted the simple is better. I save my attention for decisions that I care about. And most of the time, I just don't want to look bad, but I'm perfectly fine looking mediocre.
I don't even know if I've ever seen you wear a pair of shorts.
I've worn shorts. There's summertime, it gets hot.
Okay.
I have shorts.
Look, there people have definitely said there is a Mike uniform.
Yeah.
Which I guess I'm sort of, well,
You are in all gray today.
I am in all gray today. But there's people like, oh, well, your cargo shorts and a t-shirt and the hat and beard,
Uh-huh.
I think, and they're like, oh, that is the Mike thing. Which, I try to mix that up sometimes, but I also present the way I feel most comfortable.
Yeah. And I am optimistic that the with greater acceptance of feather boas, that the world is actually going to be more accepting of the variety and the diversity of what a gay man and what pansexual women look like. They can be anybody. And I think the increasing awareness of the diversity of both styles and approaches to life make that a little more accessible or acceptable. And I think that's a good thing. And I prefer it when we can't identify someone's sexuality from what they're wearing.
And you shouldn't.
Right?
Like, you should never infer by what someone's wearing or even what someone sounds like
Yeah.
or looks like what their sexual orientation is, particularly because sexual orientation is not something that is necessarily a binary.
100%.
Right.
Yeah.
Which, again, is something that I'm like, when are we going to get people to understand this?
Yeah.
Was there ever a sense that you struggled with that at all? Or were you just like, I am who I am and it is what it is?
I would say, yes, I guess I did struggle with it a little bit because I didn't feel like the binary applied to me. So I identified as straight for most of my youth and early adulthood, but it wasn't a thing that felt like it mattered that much to me. Like I thought, oh, could I be gay? Am I gay? And I thought about it in great detail and thought, it doesn't seem to be particularly like driving me to, like, I didn't feel like I was repressing that.
Mm-hmm.
I was a little curious about it, but wasn't repressing it. Then sort of later in life, in situations where, if I can be a little explicit,
Be as explicit as you want.
in more sort of group sex settings, I started realizing that, the bodies that are here, that if the people are having a good time, I don't really feel like there's a difference in whether I can connect because they have a female presenting body or male. And I was like, well, I can play with men. And I did. And I was like, oh, this is felt completely normal and quite nice. And from there, I was just like, oh, yeah, okay, I'm pansexual. The male bodied people and trans folks are wonderful people, and all bodies are great bodies. And sort of entrance into pansexuality was very much sex based and sex focused. I'm still now working through my sort of internalized challenges with male intimacy and trying to figure out if I could have an intimate romantic relationship with a man. I have male sexual partners. I have not been in a long-term dating type romantic relationship with a man. And yeah, I've had some non-binary partners. They're more femme presenting, which I guess is, I don't know how I feel about like my own internalized feelings about that. Anyway, it's a complicated thing to examine, but
sure.
Yeah, my own relationship to men is challenging because there's a lot of really toxic stuff that not only I was exposed to and somewhat internalized, but also just was, I guess, traumatized by. I use that term carefully, like in the sense that I know people have much more serious trauma than just living in.
We're not grading traumas here.
Yeah. But being exposed to just the sort of toxic culture around masculinity, it's rough, and that takes a lot of unpacking. And I'm still working through that in terms of my ability to connect deeply with other men.
Experientially, and I'm saying this for myself, even going through like my own acceptance process, I've noticed and I've experienced difficulty, desire to and difficulty being able to connect in an intimate way with other men. I think I'm pretty far ahead in my journey at this point where like I can express that as a desire and find people who are willing to connect in that way. But one thing I've noticed, and through doing this podcast, through interacting with people that I know through your community, like all that stuff, is that for men of a certain age, there are roadblocks when it comes to connecting with other men in an intimate and not necessarily sexual way. There's the desire to want to emotionally connect or even physically connect without there being a sexual element to it. But getting over that, for lack of a better term, hump is difficult for some people. And it was difficult for me. Like, I think back to my experience, and I was having sex with guys long before I was able to hold hands with one or kiss one, or not even kiss one in a non-sexual manner, or cuddle with one, or that sort of thing. So it feels like there's this thing that exists for Gen X and elder millennials and older,
Mhm.
where, and we're, I think, in a weird position because younger guys are totally okay in a lot of cases
Mm,
with there being all of these different elements to intimacy that do not involve sex necessarily.
yeah.
Whereas people our age still have that ingrained homophobia, don't share emotions. Like it's kind of a combination of socialized masculinity, socialized homophobia, and if you grew up in a certain point, there was also AIDS hysteria in
Oh
the
yeah.
middle of all that.
Yep.
So guys in their 30s and 40s and 50s are like, oh shit, these younger people kind of have this figured out. My figuring this out was stunted or delayed or whatever. Now it's like I have these feelings and what the hell do I do?
Mm,
And I have seen since I started having sex with men, and I will put it in a pretty blunt way, guys who were totally willing to get fucked by a guy,
mhm.
but if there was any intimacy involved with that would kind of like shrink back.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that it is a particular problem for our generation because for all the reasons you identified. I mean, I think it also shows up in all the think pieces about why is it so hard for men to make friends.
Yep.
I mean, I experience that. I make new connections very quickly nowadays in life. I'm a pretty mostly extroverted person.
You are a gregarious human being.
But most of the new intimate sort of bonds that I form are with women. I tend to gravitate towards women and non-binary people. I'm just more comfortable in the initial stages, and I think I can connect with men no problem in sort of a small talk kind of way. And then the relationships tend to kind of veer sideways and just sort of go into a less intimate pathway. And I'm not sure why that is, but I think it's just yeah, some internalized stuff that I'm still unpacking, and I'm working on it actively because I am interested in working more with both men, women, and non-binary folks, as well as all the trans folks in the new work that I'm doing, the surrogacy work, and in the trainings in the early stages of the intimacy work, I found that it's been really helpful and good to connect with folks of all genders, and it is something that is very doable for me. And I'm hoping that, in a sort of selfish way, and maybe it's a little unprofessional, that this is actually going to be beneficial for me
Sure.
as a practitioner to understand myself better as to if I can do these initial stages of getting to connect with people, helping them overcome their own obstacles to intimacy, that maybe it'll give me some insights as well into how I connect more deeply with or how I can connect more deeply with men, both on a friendship type intimacy level or even someday on a romantic level with them. So
Right.
it's definitely a journey.
It is. And that's a good segue into the surrogacy conversation.
Yeah,
Now, I deliberately kept myself a little ignorant. I didn't read too much in what you had discussed with me just because I wanted the conversation to sort of be fresh
okay.
from, expanding knowledge on my part. So, share a little bit about this program that you have recently completed and what that means.
Sure. Yeah. So surrogate partner therapy is a modality of therapist supported help for patients who have issues with intimacy. So, for example, it could be trauma based, it could be just inexperience based. There's all sorts of reasons why folks have, as we've been discussing, barriers to intimacy. And so, surrogate partner therapy works in a triadic model where there's the client who has a licensed therapist or clinician of some sort that is doing talk therapy with the patient. Then there is the surrogate, who will be me in this case. And what the surrogate does is work through a series of exercises that are both talk based and touch based with the client. And in between each session, the client and the surrogate will be talking with the talk therapist. So it's sort of this cycle of The client meets with the talk therapist. Then the client meets with the surrogate. Surrogate talks to the therapist, client talks to the therapist, and on and on and on. And the other key elements of this model is that one, it's always triadic. There's always a supervising clinician involved. Two, it's always in a fixed duration. There's an arc to the therapy. So you start with an initial meeting with all three of the participants, the therapist or the clinician, the surrogate, and the client, and you discuss the client's therapeutic goals. You identify those, and then the surrogate comes up with a plan, a sort of a treatment plan that is experience based, and you work through a series of exercises that will get, ideally, to the place that the client wants to get.
Okay.
And that can include anything from, learning how to, I guess, how to talk about their feelings, how to express needs, how to set boundaries. Could be how to have an orgasm on their own or with help. It could involve full-on sexual intercourse. It could involve going out in public and experiencing what it feels like to be out on a date in public. Those are things that are experiences that might not be available to someone who's maybe never had them or has obstacles to having them, whether it's trauma based or some other mental health related issue that's preventing them from doing that. And obviously, talk therapists have limits on what they can do.
Sure.
For ethical reasons, they have limits on what they can do with their patients, and for good reason. That doesn't mean someone else can't help with that. And this all came out of the 1970s, those Masters and Johnson big studies that they did on sexual health. And they found that with folks that had, at that time, they called it sexual dysfunction. Usually it was male impotence for the most part, and some other issues. But if the person had a willing partner, like a wife in most cases, then they would prescribe certain exercises to do with their partner. And they would go through these intimacy exercises, and in many cases, it would be helpful. The problem is not everyone has a willing and supportive spouse at home who will take on that role.
Sure.
And in modern terms, if your talk therapist is telling you, oh, this would be great for you to do if you could gently explore these things, you could go on Tinder or Grindr, but you're probably not going to find the right kind of support that you need. And it can be very challenging for people who sometimes don't even know what it is that they want or need to know what they want or need, and to find someone who is willing to compassionately help them with that. And so there is this legitimate service that exists, and it's growing in popularity now. It's still in the early days. There's a well-established group out in California called IPSA, International Professional Surrogates Association, I believe. And there's now a newer, slightly more modern version in a group called the Surrogate Partner Collective, which is where I got my certification.
Mm-hmm.
And I, recently finished their training, and I am now in the apprentice stage where I'm taking on my early clients with a mentor, a surrogate mentor who's an experienced practitioner who is going to be monitoring my cases, and I'll check in with them in addition to checking in with the therapist and the client. So
that's awesome.
Yeah.
It does seem like the articulation piece for a lot of people can be really difficult. Like, there's the understanding of this isn't happening, or this isn't happening the way I want it to happen, or whatever. The why, and maybe I'm only speaking for myself here, I don't know. The why is A, often convoluted, and B, just isn't something that's very easily expressible.
Yeah, that can be true.
Right.
And that is something that a client can work through the initial stages with their clinician. In therapy, they can talk about trying to understand what it is that is the roadblock. And if they can identify it, great. Even if they can't identify exactly what it is, sometimes taking very small baby steps towards that, whatever it is, whether it's an act or a particular type of conversation, or whatever it is that they're feeling obstructed from reaching, if they go through and inch towards it in a supportive environment with a surrogate, they might be able to identify what it is that they're feeling. Like maybe it's they start to get very nervous when someone starts to touch them. Maybe it has to do with they have a fear of kissing. Maybe they have some sort of traumatic relationship to a particular body part or nudity or something that, I mean, everyone has a different thing.
Right.
And finding out what that is can sometimes be helped by careful and compassionate exploring, which again is not something that one can always do in a traditional therapy model.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, therapists are, and again, like you said, for good reasons,
Yep.
pretty hands off. Like literally hands off. Yeah.
Yes.
You know, I feel like the only time I've ever had any sort of physical exchange with a therapist is like initially maybe you shake hands before the first session.
Yep.
And then, you know, maybe once or twice if I have left a therapist for reasons like moving or whatever, you know, there's maybe a hug at the end. I can think of that happening once.
Right. Yeah.
But physical intimacy is a need or a desire for a lot of people
Yeah.
in a therapeutic or therapeutic related space. And again, I understand why that is generally frowned upon, but also I think it's a need.
It absolutely is a need. And I think with therapists, one of the reasons why there is a pretty harsh line preventing it is, well, one, I think the therapy relationship is ideally one that is able to continue on for a long period of time and not to act as an actual intimate relationship itself.
Right.
They are meant to be a guide, a resource, a therapeutic model. You know, they're helping the person recover from something or learn to better handle the difficulties that they face in life.
Right.
And so for that relationship to be ongoing and stay in that lane, it does need to have guardrails that say no sexual intimacy and probably not even a whole lot of affectionate physical intimacy. And that makes sense. With the surrogate partner relationship, it's slightly different, but also the same concerns exist. The surrogate partner relationship is not meant to be a replacement for a healthy, ongoing, intimate, physical and or romantic relationship.
Right.
What it's meant to be is a model or a trial run of that kind of thing. That's why it has to be a fixed duration and why it has to have the supervision of a clinician. Because it is important that, I mean, I get this question a lot. It's like, oh, well, what happens when your client might develop feelings for you? And the answer is, well, that's okay. The whole point is to address the feelings that come up and work through them. And through the process of the surrogate relationship, we are going from learning the basics of how to connect to someone. And then, in addition to that, how to communicate about not only our desires, but our feelings that come up. So if in that process, client develops feelings, or perhaps I have feelings, we will talk about those things because that's what you do in a healthy relationship.
Right.
And that also includes ending the relationship. That is a core component of the therapeutic relationship that involves a surrogate, is to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. So there is a sort of a de-escalation at the end, and then a termination of the relationship. And there will be a bit of mourning, because if the surrogate connection is good and it works well, the client will have learned some things and grown, and then you have to say goodbye.
Right.
And the practices that I'm aware of that I will probably be following as well are that when a surrogate treatment plan ends, I would have sort of no more contact with the client for at least 2 years. And I've heard from other surrogates that, you know, after that period, that if they had a really wonderful connection, they might become friends, or possibly even, if they really wanted to, date the person. But it's generally frowned upon, in at least, especially in the short term. Like,
Sure.
you do not transition a surrogate relationship into a personal relationship, because ultimately it is a professional relationship. And it still remains important, just as it is for talk therapists, to have these guardrails to prevent misunderstanding as to what is going on, and to ultimately to help the client heal and move on with their own life, and gain some skills and gain some understanding about relationships.
What was the impetus for you deciding to pursue this?
I think it was from, well, I mean, during my polyamorous sort of awakening, I guess, or reawakening, whatever, however you want to call it, I found myself just really appreciating the joy that I felt in loving relationships and finding incredible value even in the shorter relationships and the ones that were not necessarily going to form core partnerships, like to become something that's going to be in my life forever. And I have a number of core relationships that matter immensely to me, and I'm nurturing those to be lifelong connections, as well as other relationships that are sort of different, that are smaller or take a sort of narrower slice of my life, but they're really valuable too.
Mm-hmm.
And in this sort of understanding of like the value of these relationships, I realized that I felt very strongly about wanting to connect with other people who didn't have enough love or affection or touch in their life. And so I found myself often connecting with people who wanted to connect with me, even though sometimes they wanted more than what I wanted. And my thought in doing that was, oh, well, I can't give them everything they want, but I can give them a little something that they would enjoy. And I would enjoy doing that. And it would make me feel good. Now, sometimes that works. Sometimes that caused problems.
Sure.
And I had to sort of pause and think, like, am I doing a good thing in doing that? Or am I being kind of selfish, or maybe it's even narcissistic? I don't know.
Mm.
To say yes to someone that I'm not as enthusiastic about as they are enthusiastic about me. And I had to give that a lot of thought and realize that I want to help people, and I want to help people in this particular way, but maybe doing it in a more professional setting and focusing more on what do they really need by working with them and their therapist is better. And I learned about surrogate partner therapy from a therapist who I met through the poly community, who connected me to a surrogate. And I had a wonderful conversation with him. He connected me to the folks that then do the training that I went out to San Francisco to do. And since then, I've been completely convinced that this is a thing that will, be a satisfying and enjoyable next stage to my long and varied career.
I love that though. How does this? I can feel like there's a through line between doing this work and the community building that you do.
Mm.
I'm not sure if I can completely identify it, but obviously you take joy out of fostering and building community as well. And I wonder if those two things come from the same place.
I think for me, the through line between those two aspects of my life are that I deeply appreciate and I'm a huge fan of love, sex, and intimacy. And I don't think that any of those are overrated. And I actually I think they're undervalued in our society, despite complaints that it's ever present, that everything is focused on sex and everyone's too obsessed with love. They're the most powerful, wonderful elements of being alive.
Yeah.
And yes, many times it's commodified and corrupted and treated badly, but I think that they're so powerful, and spending time to understand love, sex, and intimacy is one of the most valuable things people can do. And learning how to relate to other people in a way that is sustainable and replicable is essential to being, at least it is for me, to being a happy, well-adjusted adult. And they don't teach us much about that growing up. And
If anything.
yeah, exactly. Most of the time they're teaching us things that make it worse and harder.
Yes.
They're sort of teaching us the bad things.
Right.
So yeah, in fostering communities around non-monogamy and polyamory, I, I am trying to create spaces where folks can come and learn and explore and connect with other people who think non-conventionally, so that they can learn and find their own path. And yes, this work that I'm doing in the surrogate partner world is an extension of that on a more one-on-one basis, because it matters to me that I not do any damage. And in trying to help people one on one, as I sort of thought I was in my personal life, I was getting a little afraid that there were maybe unintended consequences of
Sure,
what I was doing.
sure. One thing that I'm interested in knowing as someone who sees the work that you do, and this is actually so there is a Brooklyn Poly Discord server,
Yep.
uh, and polyamory and non-monogamy tend to bring out very unique personalities.
Sure.
What is it like to have to trying to think of the right word to use here, to have to sort of to manage
Mm.
all of these unique and interesting personalities. There's a lot of neurodiversity.
Yep.
There are some very unique people.
Yes.
And I would imagine having to be kind of at the point of the spear for a lot of misunderstandings, disagreements, whatever like that would take a toll on me. I'm
Mm.
just wondering like how you're able to handle that.
Well, the real answer is that that is mostly not me. I
Fair.
I am not the skill or the brains behind the community management of the Discord. I am an enthusiastic hype man for the Discord,
All right.
and I am a participant, and I do get involved in the moderation for sure. But we have two much more qualified mods on the Discord who I learn from every single time there's an incident. And in terms of setting it up, they have been the ones who took the lead on that. The picnics and the events that I organize are good fun, but the Discord itself was the brainchild of one of the other mods, and her partner is like his work is as a community, or sorry, as a online community manager. So
Okay.
this is his profession, and he is incredibly skilled at it. And so the two of them, with my eager
Hype
support and
manishness.
yeah,
Yes.
with my eager support and open ears for learning, we created the Discord and set up the structure of it. And the community management that we do is very, we try to take a very light touch. And so we choose carefully what channels we set up and the descriptions for what is appropriate behavior in those channels. And for the most part, our Discord sort of self polices, which is wonderful. I think what I've learned is that with a little bit of tone setting and norm setting at the outset, you don't have to intervene that often.
Mm.
And we try to be very responsive when an issue comes up. We work quickly and try to be as fair and think as long term, like what is the impact of this if we do this, that, or the other thing. And yeah, so I would say I'm an eager student at the feet of my other mods who are much, much better at navigating the very delicate and sometimes very complex issues that can come up on a Discord server with a very diverse group of people, which I'm very proud of, by the way. I think the Brooklyn Poly, both the Discord and the server and the community, the picnics and things, I think we have probably the most diverse and wonderful group of people that come out of all the poly communities, not to compare. But
No, it's wonderful to have that, particularly in New York City, where I think by comparison to smaller cities or small towns where there is usually a smaller concentration of people who are polyamorous or non-monogamous.
yeah.
One thing I've noticed is that the communities in those smaller towns tend to like move as a unit. Like they stick together, they go to the same things, they meet at the same places, they have dinners with each other, like that kind of thing. Whereas in New York, it's almost so normalized that people don't have to that need for community, which might even be born out of a need for safety,
Yeah.
doesn't really exist in a city this big with this many diverse people anymore. You know, when I first came back to New York in 2015 and really kind of had in my head that I wanted to involve myself with this community, I didn't know about the picnics and the happy hours and that kind of stuff. And in the really 2 or 3 years since I've really made an effort to attend these things and be a part of these things, it feels much more like a community, like a family,
Mm.
than other sort of events that I attend in the city where it just feels more like meat markety, less community
Right.
based, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think the Discord server that we put up during pandemic is a big reason why there's a sort of a continuity between the events that we have for how that sort of family vibe has developed, which I think is fantastic.
Yeah.
I love our events. I put on most of those, but since we got the Discord, there's a place where the community can just continue the chat, and so people can keep talking in between events, and they get to put up their own events, and so there are little movie nights and craft afternoons and
Right.
all these things, hiking trips that people just spontaneously organize, that have been absolutely fantastic for community building in a way that no amount of sort of organized from the top picnics or roundtables they're not going to replicate that.
Right.
And so it's been a really wonderful sort of, I guess, development over the last couple of years that I'm really proud of. That not proud in the sense that I did it, but proud that this community has kind of come together and exists in a way that, I mean, I was so happy and I got so much value just from the poly happy hour that I found, which was the downtown Brooklyn polyamory social, which someone else founded.
Right.
And she did a great job of hosting this event monthly in a bar, and it had 10 to 20 people show up, and they would just sort of hang around and drink and occasionally talk about polyamory things, but mostly just hang out. And from that, we turned it into this much larger community that has just a wide diversity of events and a much bigger diversity of people coming in, and it's just been great. So really proud of the whole way it's just grown. So
I'm happy to be a part of it. Thank you, Marco, for taking the time to do this episode. We actually recorded it at his place. Normally, these episodes are recorded either via Zoom or some sort of analog to Zoom, or they're recorded at my apartment. So I actually went on the road for this one. And thank you, Marco, for opening your home to me and for having this conversation. Marco don't have no social media. So if you want to find him and get a little bit more information about the surrogacy work that he does, you can go to anteros.care. That is ANTEROS.care. Thank you very much, Marco, for sharing your story and sharing your time. Would love to have you back on the show if you are willing. And if you live in the New York area and you're interested in checking out meetups for polyamorous or ethically non-monogamous people, you can find the Brooklyn Poly Group on meetup.com, and the picnics will probably restart in March, if weather permits, and you can get to meet a lot of groovy, cool people, including Marco and quite possibly myself. So there you go. Thanks, Marco. Appreciate you taking the time to be on the show. Thank you for listening to Detoxicity. I hope you found this particular episode interesting. And if you are new, I hope you go back and listen to all of the older episodes. Once again, my name is Mike Joseph. I am the host and producer of this show. And there are a lot of things that you can do to continue to support our mission, continue to support this podcast. Follow me on social media. I am on Instagram, Twitter, and I'm on TikTok as DetoxPod Guy. You can also send me an email if you'd like. I'm at detoxpod@gmail.com. I am always on the hunt for people with interesting, inspirational, and powerful stories. So if you know somebody who fits that bill, or if you yourself fit that bill, please don't hesitate to drop me a line via email or via social media. Please make sure you subscribe on your podcast platform that you're listening to this on. Rate, comment, help a brother out, help us move up in the rankings. Follow me on social media. Like I said, follow our Patreon, or subscribe to my Patreon, actually. Patreon.com/detoxicitypod. You get access to exclusive episodes. You get episodes a little earlier than the general public. You get a cool ass sticker, lots of stuff. Once again, patreon.com/detoxicitypod. Quick shout out to Calvin Williams for providing the music and doing his magic on the logo, which was originally designed by Jacob Block. I thank you all for listening. I wish you all the best. Please take care of each other. Till next time, peace.